Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Sometimes sharing our stories is the only way we remind ourselves we survived them. I used to wake up every morning believing I had somehow won at life. That's the only way I can describe it. I wasn't rich, I wasn't famous, but I felt chosen. Chosen by love, chosen by stability, chosen by a future that finally felt safe after a childhood where nothing ever stayed still. My name is Sarah, and for 12 years I was married to the man I thought was my miracle. I met Daniel when I was 26. I still remember the first time he smiled at me, the way his eyes softened like he was already listening before I spoke. He wasn't flashy, he didn't charm a room, but he made you feel like the only person in it. That was his gift. That was the trap, too, though I didn't know it then. We built our life slowly. Dinner dates turned into shared groceries turned into a lease, then a mortgage, then routines so familiar they felt sacred. Sunday mornings with coffee on the porch, Wednesday night leftovers, the way he'd reach for my hand in the grocery store aisle without even looking, like muscle memory. I mistook consistency for loyalty. I mistook comfort for truth. Everyone told me I was lucky. My mother would say it on the phone like a blessing. My friends would tease me about having the perfect husband. Even strangers noticed how calm we seemed together. And I believed them. I believed all of it because nothing bad was happening. And sometimes that's all it takes to convince you everything is good. We talked about dreams the way people do when they think they have time, traveling more, maybe adopting a child someday, growing old in that house with the cracked kitchen tile we kept saying we'd replace. I imagined gray hair and shared jokes and sitting side by side in silence that didn't feel empty. I imagined a lifetime because nothing had ever given me a reason not to. The truth is, I was so focused on the dream that I stopped paying attention to the details, the small shifts, the tiny silences, the way he started coming home later but always had a reasonable explanation, the way his phone never left his side, the way his laughter changed just slightly, like it had somewhere else to land now. I didn't question him, not because I was weak, but because I trusted him. And trust, when it's real, doesn't interrogate. It assumes, it believes, it fills in the blanks with love instead of fear. Looking back, I can trace the beginning of the end to a single night that felt completely harmless at the time, a Thursday. I remember because I cooked his favorite meal, lemon chicken with roasted potatoes, and the kitchen still smelled warm when he walked in. He kissed my cheek, distracted, already pulling out his phone. I joked about him being married to that screen. He smiled but didn't laugh. We ate mostly in silence, not an uncomfortable silence, just a quiet one, the kind that creeps in when you've run out of things to say but don't know why. After dinner, he said he needed to step out for a bit, something about a work issue. He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. I remember standing at the sink watching his reflection in the dark window as he grabbed his keys. Something in my chest tightened just for a second, a warning, a whisper, but I pushed it down. I told myself I was being dramatic. Love doesn't live on suspicion, I reminded myself. Love lives on trust. That night, I went to bed alone, again. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, and wondered when our life had started feeling like I was waiting instead of living. When he finally came home, he slid into bed quietly, like a guest. I pretended to be asleep. If I'm honest, the hardest part to admit is this. A part of me already knew something was wrong. I just wasn't ready to name it. Naming it would mean risking the dream, and I wasn't strong enough for that yet. Weeks passed, then months. The distance grew but never exploded. It just stretched, thin and fragile like glass about to crack. I filled the space with optimism, with excuses, with memories of how good we used to be. I told myself marriages go through phases. Everyone says that. I clung to those words like a life raft. Then came the day everything broke open, not with shouting or confrontation, but with a moment so quiet it still echoes in me. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was folding laundry in the bedroom, his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He'd left it there by accident, which almost never happened. I didn't intend to look. I truly didn't. But the screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize, followed by a message preview that stole the air from my lungs. "You miss me already." That was it. 4 words, enough to dismantle 12 years. My hands started shaking. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a friend, a coworker, a misunderstanding. I picked up the phone like it might burn me. My heart was pounding so loud I thought I might pass out. I unlocked it. He hadn't changed the password. Maybe he never thought he'd need to. What I found wasn't a single message. It was a whole life, conversations filled with affection, inside jokes, plans, photos I'd never seen, a version of my husband I didn't recognize but somehow knew intimately. He spoke to her with a softness he hadn't used on me in years. I sat down on the bed, the laundry spilling to the floor, and felt something inside me go completely still, not break, not shatter, just stop, like my heart had shut the door to protect itself. In that moment, the dream didn't just end, it exposed itself as an illusion I had been maintaining alone. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, holding the phone, feeling stupid for all the times I'd defended him, for all the moments I'd ignored my own instincts, for loving someone so deeply that I'd abandoned myself in the process. When he came home later that day, I was still sitting in the same place. The house was quiet. He took one look at my face and knew. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need an announcement. It arrives fully formed. He didn't deny it. That hurt more than if he had. He just sat across from me, head in his hands, and said, "I never meant for it to happen." As if betrayal was an accident, as if my life were collateral damage. That was the moment I realized the dream I thought I was living had been built on my silence, and whatever came next, I would never be quiet again. When Daniel said those words, "I never meant for it to happen," something inside me shifted from shock to clarity. It was like my mind finally caught up to what my body had known for months. I remember looking at him and realizing how small he seemed in that moment. Not small in size, but in truth. The man I had built my life around suddenly felt like a stranger who had wandered into my house wearing my husband's face. I asked him how long. That question tasted bitter the moment it left my mouth because I already knew the answer wouldn't give me relief. He hesitated, then said, "A year." A year. 12 months of lies folded into our routines, 12 months of me cooking dinners, washing his clothes, planning a future with a man who was emotionally living somewhere else. I nodded slowly, as if my body was agreeing to something my heart refused to accept. He told me it started at work. Of course it did. Late nights, shared complaints, someone who listened without expecting anything back. He said it didn't mean anything at first. That word again, anything. As if meaning were the only measure of damage. As if intention erased consequence. I let him talk because interrupting him felt like giving him more importance than he deserved. I wanted to hear how he justified dismantling our life. What he didn't say was almost louder than what he did. He didn't say he was unhappy with me. He didn't say our marriage was broken. He didn't say he tried to fix things. He just said it happened, like weather, like gravity, like betrayal was a force of nature instead of a series of choices made behind my back. I asked him if he loved her. He looked up then, startled like I'd crossed some invisible line. He said no too quickly. The speed of his answer told me everything. Love doesn't announce itself with certainty in moments like that. It hides, it hesitates, it weighs the cost. His pause before adding, "I love you," was the longest silence of my life. I stood up because I couldn't sit there anymore. My legs felt unsteady, but staying still felt worse. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the sink where I'd washed his plate just hours earlier. I thought about all the ordinary moments that now felt contaminated. How many times had he kissed me after texting her? How many nights had I fallen asleep next to him while his mind was replaying conversations I would never be part of? He followed me, saying my name softly, like that might undo everything. I told him I needed space. He nodded, relief flickering across his face, and that hurt too. Relief meant he didn't have to decide anything yet. It meant I was still carrying the weight of us. That night, he slept in the guest room. I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like my body was mourning something my mind couldn't fully grasp. I wasn't just losing a husband, I was losing the story I'd been telling myself about my life, the proof that stability was real, the belief that if you loved well enough, it would be returned. In the days that followed, I moved through the world like a ghost. I went to work, I smiled when required, I answered questions with practiced normalcy. Inside, I was unraveling. Friends noticed, of course, they always do. But I wasn't ready to speak it out loud. Saying it would make it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. Daniel tried, in his own way. He brought flowers, he cooked dinner, he offered therapy, he said he'd end it. He said all the things men say when they're afraid of losing comfort more than they're sorry for causing pain. I listened, numb, watching him perform remorse like it was a script he'd rehearsed. One evening, about 2 weeks after everything came out, I asked to see his phone again. He handed it to me without resistance. That alone told me he thought transparency could fast-track forgiveness. I scrolled through messages that had gone cold, but not empty. Even after he said it was over, there were traces, lingering words, emotional breadcrumbs. I handed the phone back and felt something inside me harden. That was when I realized the truth I had been avoiding. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the fact that he had rewritten our marriage without my consent. He had decided I was optional in my own life. I started sleeping in the guest room after that, not because I wanted distance, but because I needed air. Our bedroom felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. Every object carried memory, and memory felt like punishment. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes looked older, not tired, wiser in a way I hadn't asked to be. I placed my hand on the counter and made a promise I didn't yet know how to keep. I would not disappear to make this easier for him. That weekend, I finally told my sister. We sat on her couch, my hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched, and the words came out in fragments. She listened without interrupting, her face soft but steady. When she finished, she said something that cracked something open in me. She said, "You don't have to decide anything right now, but you do have to decide not to lie to yourself." That sentence stayed with me. I realized how much of my life I had spent smoothing over discomfort to keep the peace, how often I'd chosen quiet over truth. This time, the cost of silence was too high. I began therapy on my own, not couples therapy, not yet. I needed a space where my feelings didn't have to be balanced against his guilt. In that room, with a stranger who had no stake in my marriage, I said things I'd never admitted before, that I'd felt lonely long before the affair, that I'd shrunk myself to keep us stable, that part of me was angry not just at him, but at myself. Daniel noticed the change. I spoke differently. I asked harder questions. I stopped cushioning my words. One night, after a long conversation that ended without resolution, he asked me if I was still in love with him. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because I was finally allowing myself to tell the truth. "I don't know," I said, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that answer. because uncertainty, I was learning, was better than living a lie. And whatever happened next, whether we stayed or parted, I knew one thing with painful clarity. The dream I thought I was living had cost me my voice, and I was finally ready to hear it again. The days after I admitted I didn't know if I still loved him were some of the quietest of my life. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. The kind that presses against your chest and makes even small decisions feel exhausting. Daniel stopped asking questions after that. I think my uncertainty scared him more than anger ever could. Anger can be negotiated with. Uncertainty means control is already slipping away. We started orbiting each other like strangers sharing a space. Polite, careful, distant. He'd ask if I'd eaten. I'd ask how work was. Conversations that floated on the surface, never daring to dive. At night, I could hear him moving in the guest room, the floorboards creaking like the house itself was restless. I began to notice how much of my energy had always gone into managing his comfort. Even now, in the aftermath of his betrayal, part of me still wanted to make this easier for him. That realization made me angry in a way I hadn't felt before. Not explosive anger, focused anger, the kind that sharpens instead of burns. One evening, I came home from therapy and found him sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, counseling brochures, books about rebuilding trust. He looked up at me with that familiar, hopeful expression, the one that used to melt my resistance. "I'm trying," he said. I believed him. That was the problem. I believed he was trying now, but trying after betrayal is not the same as choosing faithfulness before it. I sat across from him and felt the weight of a truth settle into place. His effort was real, but it was reactive. My pain had become the catalyst for his growth, and I couldn't unsee that. I asked him why he hadn't tried like this before. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Silence answered for him. That night, I cried for the first time since discovering the affair. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears that slipped down my face as I lay in the dark. I cried for the woman I had been, the one who believed love was enough, the one who thought loyalty was automatic, the one who chose someone meant they'd choose you back without question. In the following weeks, I started doing small things just for myself, going for long walks after work, eating dinner alone at my favorite cafe, buying flowers and placing them in the house without any occasion. These acts felt rebellious, like I was reclaiming territory that had slowly been taken from me without my notice. Daniel noticed. He asked if I was pulling away. I told him I was pulling inward, that I needed to remember who I was outside of us. He nodded, but I could see the fear behind his eyes. The more I centered myself, the less control he had over the outcome. One night, he finally broke. He told me he was terrified of losing me, that the affair had been a mistake born of insecurity, that he'd never stopped loving me. He cried in a way I'd never seen before, shoulders shaking, voice cracking. And for a moment, my instinct was to comfort him, to hold him, to make it better. But something stopped me. A voice I hadn't listened to in years. It asked a simple question. Who was comforting me? I told him I needed time apart. Not a dramatic separation, just space to think without his presence shaping my emotions. He resisted at first, suggesting compromises, schedules, anything to avoid the word apart. But I stood firm. For the first time in our marriage, my decision wasn't negotiable. He moved in with his brother the following weekend. Watching him pack a bag felt surreal. This man had been woven into every corner of my life, and now he was reduced to a suitcase and a set of keys he placed gently on the counter. He hugged me before leaving, and I let him. Not because I needed it, but because I was finally choosing freely. The house felt different without him, larger, quieter, honest. I wandered from room to room that first night, noticing how the silence didn't feel as threatening as I had imagined. It felt like possibility. Over the next few weeks, I learned things about myself that surprised me. I learned I could sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. I learned I could be lonely without being desperate. I learned that grief and relief can exist in the same breath. Daniel and I talked occasionally, practical things, bills, logistics. Sometimes feelings crept in, but I kept the boundaries firm. Distance had given me perspective. I could see our marriage clearly now, without the fog of habit. And what I saw was not the dream I thought I was living, but a partnership that had relied too heavily on my silence. One afternoon during a therapy session, my therapist asked me a question that stopped me cold. She asked me, if nothing changed from this moment forward, would you want to stay? I closed my eyes and listened to my body before my mind could interfere. The answer came quietly, but firmly, no. That answer didn't make me happy. It didn't make me sad. It made me honest. I realized then that forgiveness does not always lead to reconciliation, that love does not always survive betrayal, and that choosing yourself is not the same as failing at marriage. When I told Daniel my decision, he was calm in a way that surprised me. I think part of him had known. He said he respected my choice, that he was sorry, that he'd always care about me. I believed him. But caring, I'd learned, is not the same as protecting someone's heart. The day he came to collect the rest of his things, I stood in the doorway and watched him leave for the last time. There was sadness, yes, but there was also peace, the kind that comes from alignment, from finally living in truth. That night, I sat alone on the porch with a cup of coffee, the same way we used to on Sunday mornings. Only this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to join me. I was enough. The dream I thought I was living had ended, but in its place, something quieter and stronger was beginning. A life rooted in self-respect, a future shaped by honesty, and for the first time in a long time, I felt awake. The weeks after Daniel moved out felt strangely suspended in time. People assume that when a marriage ends, everything collapses at once, that there's a dramatic breaking point, tears on the floor, doors slamming, a clear before and after. But for me, it was quieter than that. Life didn't shatter, it thinned, like fog lifting slowly, revealing a landscape I hadn't realized I was standing in. I told people gradually. My sister already knew. A close friend at work noticed I'd stopped wearing my ring and asked gently, her voice low, like she was afraid of breaking something fragile. Each time I said the words out loud, "we're separating," they felt a little less foreign. Still painful, but less heavy, like my mouth was learning a new language. Some people reacted with shock, others with advice I hadn't asked for. People make mistakes. Marriage takes work. Are you sure you're not giving up too soon? I learned quickly who understood betrayal and who had only read about it. I stopped explaining myself. I didn't need permission to choose peace. At home, I started reclaiming spaces. I moved furniture, donated things that carried too much history, painted the bedroom a soft, neutral color that felt like breathing room. Each small change felt symbolic, like I was gently rewriting the story of the house. This wasn't the place where my dream died anymore. It was where I began again. There were moments, of course, when grief ambushed me. Songs on the radio, a restaurant we used to love, the memory of an inside joke that no one else would ever get. Those moments still knocked the wind out of me, but they didn't pull me under. I'd let them pass like waves, reminding myself that feelings are not instructions, they're visitors. Daniel reached out less and less. Our conversations became brief, polite, almost formal. I could tell he was struggling in his own way, but his pain no longer felt like my responsibility. That realization came with guilt at first. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight, but guilt slowly gave way to clarity. I'd spent too long carrying what wasn't mine. One afternoon, months later, I ran into him unexpectedly at the grocery store. We stood there awkwardly between the produce and the bread aisle, exchanging pleasantries like distant relatives. He looked different, tired, older. So did I, probably, but there was something else in me now, a steadiness that hadn't existed before. When we said goodbye, I walked to my car and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, heart beating fast. I realized I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the need to call anyone. I just breathed, and that's when I knew I was healing. Therapy continued to peel back layers I didn't know I had. I talked about my childhood, my fear of abandonment, my tendency to overfunction in relationships. I saw how my dream hadn't just been about Daniel. It had been about proving something, that I was worthy of staying, that if I loved hard enough, no one would leave. Letting go of that belief was harder than letting go of the marriage. Slowly, I began imagining a future without fear at its center. Not a perfect future, just an honest one. I didn't rush into dating. I didn't need to. I was learning how to be alone without feeling empty, how to enjoy my own company, how to trust myself again. One evening, sitting on the same porch where this new chapter had quietly begun, I thought about the woman I had been at the start of this story, the one who thought she was living her dream. I didn't judge her anymore. I felt compassion for her. She did the best she could with what she knew, and now I was doing better because I knew more. Betrayal had stripped me down, but it had also given me something unexpected: freedom. Not the loud, celebratory kind, the quiet kind that comes from self-respect, from knowing that I can survive heartbreak, from trusting that my worth isn't dependent on someone else's loyalty. The dream I thought I was living wasn't real, but the life I'm building now is, and it's grounded in truth, courage, and a love that starts with me. By the time the divorce paperwork arrived in the mail, I had already grieved the marriage in ways I didn't know were possible. Still, holding those papers in my hands made everything feel final in a way nothing else had. This wasn't just emotional separation anymore. It was legal, permanent, a signature away from closing a chapter I had once believed would be my whole book. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening the envelope. The same table where we'd eaten countless dinners, where we'd laughed, argued, planned. I noticed how calm my hands were. That surprised me. Months earlier, they would have been shaking. Now they were steady, not because it didn't hurt, but because I had already accepted the truth beneath the pain. The paperwork was clinical. Names, dates, assets divided into neat lines. It felt strange to see our life reduced to checkboxes and legal language. There was no space for the love we'd once had, no line item for broken trust or emotional labor, just facts. And in that simplicity, I felt something close to relief. I called my sister after I finished reading. She came over that evening with takeout and that quiet presence she always brought when she knew I didn't need fixing. We sat on the floor, backs against the couch, eating from cartons and talking about nothing important. At some point, she looked at me and said, "You're different." Not sad, not hardened, just different. She was right. I was. I had stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped over-explaining my choices, stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. Those habits had been so ingrained that I hadn't realized how heavy they were until I set them down. Signing the papers didn't feel like a failure. It felt like alignment, like my outside life was finally matching the truth I'd already accepted inside. When I mailed them back, I didn't cry. I stood at the mailbox, dropped the envelope in, and whispered goodbye. Not to Daniel, to the version of myself who had stayed too long out of fear. The days that followed were quiet again, but this time the quiet felt earned. I filled my time intentionally. I took a class I'd always postponed. I redecorated the living room without consulting anyone. I started journaling at night, writing things I'd never said out loud: dreams, anger, gratitude, questions without answers. Occasionally, guilt would resurface. It always does. A voice asking if I'd tried hard enough, if forgiveness could have saved us. When that voice appeared, I reminded myself of something my therapist had said. Forgiveness does not require self-betrayal. I could forgive him without returning to a place where I was diminished. One afternoon, I found an old photo album while cleaning out a closet. Pictures of us in our early years, smiling, hopeful. I flipped through it slowly, letting the memories come without judgment. That love was real. It mattered. It just wasn't meant to last forever. Accepting that didn't erase it. It honored it without letting it define my future. I realized then that closure isn't about forgetting. It's about integrating, carrying the lesson without carrying the wound. As the months passed, people stopped asking how I was doing. Life moved on, as it always does, and I moved with it. Not back to who I was, but forward into someone stronger, someone more honest, someone who knew that dreams can change, and that doesn't make them worthless. I no longer say I thought I was living my dream. I say I was living a chapter, and when it ended, I found the courage to write the next one myself. The first real morning of freedom hit me quietly, almost imperceptibly. I woke up, rolled over, and noticed the bed was just mine. No one else's weight pressed beside me. No familiar snore or restless toss. At first, it felt empty, almost cold. But then, slowly, I realized it was peaceful. I had this space all to myself, and it belonged to me alone. It was mine to fill, mine to define, mine to breathe in without guilt or explanation. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched sunlight touch the garden Daniel had once tended. I didn't feel anger or bitterness yet, just a raw awareness that my life was finally unclaimed by someone else's choices. I started keeping routines that weren't designed for us, but for me. Morning walks without checking in, evenings with music I chose, not what he might like. I started sleeping longer, laughing at things I never felt comfortable laughing at when the house had been shared. Small joys, yes, but revolutionary ones when you've spent years walking on eggshells without realizing it. Every moment was a reminder that I was learning how to inhabit my own life again. Friends became a sanctuary. My closest friends who had witnessed pieces of my suffering now became witnesses to my rebirth. We went out for brunch, for walks, for movies. I spoke openly, and this time I didn't soften my words for anyone. I told them the truth of betrayal, of heartbreak, of quiet survival, and they didn't look away. They didn't judge. They simply held space. That kind of presence is rare, and I cherished it fiercely. Work offered a strange kind of refuge. I poured myself into projects, ideas, and deadlines. I wasn't running from pain, I realized. I was learning to channel it. Energy that had been trapped in anxiety and distrust became focus. My colleagues noticed. Compliments started to land differently. Confidence wasn't something I was faking anymore. It was earned. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook open, writing dreams I had long since abandoned. Travel, career goals, even small things like hosting friends or redecorating rooms. I wrote without fear of compromise, without waiting for permission or validation. It was intoxicating. It reminded me that my identity had always been mine, even if I had let someone else shape it for a while. Then came the unexpected moment, a casual encounter that shook me more than the divorce had. I ran into Daniel again at a coffee shop near my work. He was quiet, older, softer in ways I hadn't expected. No anger, no pleas, just a polite nod, a handshake. We sat briefly, talked lightly about life and work, and parted. I was surprised by my own calm. No tears, no rage, just a faint, strange gratitude. That was all I could muster. gratitude for knowing myself, for surviving, for finally being able to sit across from him and see a man I once loved without needing him to be anything but human. As the weeks turned into months, I realized the most profound change wasn't external. It wasn't the space he vacated or the independence I claimed. It was internal. I had learned that my worth wasn't conditional on someone else's loyalty, that love could be lost without destroying my soul, that dreams can die, yes, but from their ashes something stronger can grow if you let it. I began to explore life in ways I never had before. Classes I'd postponed, hobbies I'd ignored, small adventures into the city alone. I went to art galleries, bookstores, little cafes where nobody knew me, and in that anonymity, I discovered joy I'd forgotten existed, the kind of joy that doesn't depend on anyone else's presence or absence. It's subtle, quiet, but it hums through your bones like a pulse of survival. People sometimes ask how I got through it, how I walked out of a life I had invested in for over a decade without crumbling. The answer is simple and yet complex. I chose myself. Every day, every small decision, every act of reclaiming space and voice was a step toward freedom. Choosing yourself doesn't erase pain, it reshapes it. It teaches you that heartbreak is not the end of your story. It's a plot twist that demands courage, patience, and honesty. I also learned to forgive, not Daniel, not completely, and certainly not the betrayal, but myself, for trusting, for loving deeply, for believing in something that didn't last. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about excusing the wrong. It's about releasing the grip of the past so it stops shaping your present. It's about letting yourself breathe freely again. And slowly, the world began to feel lighter. Even ordinary moments felt extraordinary. The smell of coffee in the morning, a sunny afternoon walk, friends laughing over dinner, music in an empty house. I noticed the subtleties that I had once ignored while living in the illusion of a dream. These little moments became proof that life continues, and sometimes life becomes better than the dream you thought you were living. One night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I thought about the woman I had been at the start of all this, the one who believed love was enough, the one who allowed someone else's choices to define her happiness. I sent a silent thank you to her, too. Without her trust, her hope, her vulnerability, I would not have experienced the depth of loss, but without surviving that loss, I would not have found the depth of strength that now defines me. It wasn't an easy journey. There were nights when tears came unbidden, when memories clung stubbornly, when doubt whispered insidiously. But each time, I reminded myself, surviving doesn't mean forgetting. Surviving means moving forward with truth as your guide. It means refusing to shrink into the shadows of someone else's betrayal. It means honoring yourself even when the world feels cruel. I also realized the truth about dreams. They are never static. The dream I thought I was living with Daniel was perfect only in my imagination, not in reality. Real dreams evolve. Real dreams sometimes end. But the dream worth keeping is the one that allows you to remain true to yourself, to your integrity, to your heart. And in that realization, I finally felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. Hope not built on fantasy or dependence, but on a foundation I could trust, my own strength, my own voice, my own choices. It was quiet, yes, but stronger than anything I had ever believed in before. Spring arrived slowly that year, brushing warmth over the mornings and golden light through the living room windows. The air itself seemed to promise renewal, and I welcomed it with cautious hope. I had started to treat each day like a gift I hadn't fully earned before. Simple routines, morning coffee, walks around the neighborhood, tidying the garden, became acts of reclaiming myself. The world hadn't changed, but my perception had. The same streets, the same trees, the same walls I'd once shared with Daniel now felt mine entirely, as if I had finally returned home, to myself. I started journaling every morning, pouring out thoughts, memories, and emotions before the day could crowd them with distractions. Writing became a kind of therapy, a way to trace the contours of my own resilience. I didn't hold back anymore. I wrote about betrayal, anger, grief, and the creeping fear I'd never feel whole again. And slowly, I began to write about hope, about joy, about plans that no one else's choices could compromise. The act of putting words on paper made my heart lighter. It was tangible proof that I still existed, fully, beyond heartbreak. Social connections became a lifeline. I reconnected with friends I had neglected in the past, people whose energy and honesty reminded me of life beyond my marriage. We went on hikes, coffee runs, impromptu weekend trips. For the first time in years, I laughed so freely that tears streamed down my cheeks. Laughter was no longer bittersweet. It was real, unabashed, my own. I realized how much I had surrendered in the name of stability, and each smile was a small rebellion against the past. At work, I took on new responsibilities I had avoided before. The confidence I had regained was palpable. Colleagues began to notice my presence differently. I spoke with authority and clarity, unafraid to share my opinions, unafraid to stand for myself. It was as if reclaiming my personal life had given me courage in all areas of existence. I felt alive in ways I hadn't in years. I also faced moments of unexpected pain. A song on the radio would dredge up memories of us. A familiar scent or a shared joke would pierce me, reminding me that the past, though behind me, still existed. Some nights, grief returned uninvited, knocking at my chest like a persistent ghost. But this time, I could sit with it without letting it consume me. I learned to breathe through the ache, to acknowledge it without letting it dictate my future. One afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was careful, measured. He asked how I was. I felt the old instinct to soften, to make things easy, but I stopped myself. I spoke the truth instead. "I'm healing," I said. "I'm finding my life again." He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He listened quietly, and I realized in that moment that he had no power to hurt me anymore. Not really. I had taken that power back long ago, in small but steady steps. Healing wasn't linear. Some days felt heavier than others when doubt crept in or loneliness pressed too close. But over time, those days became less frequent. I learned to trust myself, to trust my judgment, my instincts, my resilience. I learned that vulnerability didn't mean weakness. It meant openness, a willingness to feel deeply without surrendering your core. That lesson had been painfully earned, but it was now indelible. By midsummer, I had begun to dream again. Not fantasies or illusions, but real, attainable dreams. I considered moving to a new city for work, exploring travel, even adopting a dog. Little by little, life was opening its doors again, and I walked through them with intention, no longer carrying the weight of someone else's choices. I realized the real lesson wasn't just about surviving betrayal. It was about reclaiming myself, about recognizing that the love I gave so freely, so completely, was valuable and should be directed toward people and endeavors that honored it. It was about understanding that the life I thought I was living was never truly mine, while I sacrificed my voice and boundaries for the comfort of someone else. I also started reflecting on forgiveness differently. Forgiving Daniel didn't mean excusing his choices. It didn't mean forgetting or inviting him back. It meant releasing myself from carrying his guilt. Forgiving him was a gift I gave to me, a way of loosening the chains of anger and resentment that had threatened to suffocate me. By the end of summer, I found myself laughing more than crying, smiling more than sighing, and feeling a sense of peace I had never thought possible. I realized that the hardest, most painful moments had shaped me into someone stronger, wiser, and more attuned to her own worth. The betrayal that had once felt like a complete annihilation of my life was now a crucible that forged my resilience. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky glowed amber and pink, casting long shadows across the garden. I sipped my tea and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 12 years of love, 12 years of trust, and then the betrayal that nearly destroyed me, but didn't. I breathed in deeply and realized something important. The dream I thought I was living with Daniel was a lesson, not a loss. It had shown me how to navigate heartbreak, how to honor myself, and how to survive a life-altering betrayal with dignity intact. And in that moment, I understood that life would always be imperfect, always be uncertain. But now I was prepared. I had learned the most essential truth. My happiness, my worth, and my life belonged to me, and no one had the power to take them away. Fall arrived with a chill that seeped into the mornings, wrapping the world in a quiet stillness. I loved it in a way I hadn't before. The season seemed to mirror the inner work I'd been doing, the shedding of old layers, the letting go of what no longer served me, and the patient preparation for something new. I watched the leaves turn and fall, realizing how much I had needed to let go of Daniel, of the illusion of our life, to finally breathe freely again. I had begun spending more time outside the house, rediscovering parts of the city I had ignored for years. Cafes where I could sit with a notebook in my thoughts, little bookstores with shelves I could wander for hours, parks where I could walk and breathe in solitude. These spaces felt like extensions of myself, places where I didn't have to perform or accommodate anyone else. For the first time, I understood how much of myself I had given away, unknowingly, in the name of marriage. Friends became my chosen family in a way that surprised me. We shared meals, laughter, and the quiet companionship that I had missed. One friend, Emma, became almost like a mentor, listening to the intricacies of my story without judgment, helping me process the betrayal and reminding me that my feelings were valid. I started to realize that community isn't just about fun or convenience. It's about presence, about being seen and held, even when life is messy. Therapy continued to unravel the layers of self-doubt I had carried for years. I began to see patterns I had never acknowledged before, my tendency to overfunction in relationships, to prioritize others' comfort above my own, to avoid conflict at any cost. Understanding these patterns was painful, but it was also liberating. Each insight was a tool, a key that unlocked a small piece of freedom. I started to notice how I had allowed fear of loss to dictate my choices for too long. That fear had kept me silent, had kept me blind, had allowed betrayal to grow unnoticed until it became undeniable. One rainy afternoon, I decided to walk without an umbrella, letting the cold drops soak me, drench my coat, and wash over me. It was symbolic, of course, though I didn't realize it until later. I walked through puddles, feeling the water splash around my shoes, and I thought about how long I had carried pain like it was a weight I had to protect. But now, walking alone in the rain, I felt lighter. The betrayal had been devastating, yes, but I had survived. I had rebuilt. I had emerged. Work had also changed. With a newfound confidence, I took on responsibilities I had avoided. I asked questions I had previously swallowed. I spoke in meetings with clarity and authority, no longer shrinking to make others comfortable. Colleagues noticed. I noticed. The pride in my own competence and the trust I began to place in my own judgment became a quiet but constant source of joy. It was proof that life continues and that even after betrayal, one can rise stronger. One evening, as I walked home through the amber-lit streets, I reflected on the months behind me. I realized I hadn't spoken to Daniel much since our brief encounter at the coffee shop months ago. I wondered how he was doing, of course, but without anxiety or longing. The fear, the heartbreak, the obsessive questioning had all softened. I realized I could think of him and our past without being undone by it. That was perhaps the most significant sign of healing, the ability to remember without reliving. Around the same time, I began considering possibilities I had pushed aside before: travel, a career change, even opening myself to love again someday, though carefully and with boundaries. I realized that trust in someone else would never be blind again. It had to be measured, balanced with awareness, and rooted in respect. That knowledge didn't make me bitter, it made me cautious, wise, and ultimately hopeful. I also began to appreciate solitude in ways I hadn't before. Sitting with myself became a practice, a kind of meditation. I discovered that I could be completely present with my own thoughts, without fear, without longing, without expectation. I started journaling in the evenings, cataloging feelings, ambitions, gratitude, and even anger. Writing became a ritual, a way to honor my emotional truth without judgment. Around Halloween, I invited my friends over for a small gathering. The night was filled with laughter, good food, and warmth. I noticed that I could enjoy their company fully without thinking about who was missing or what had been lost. The home I had feared would always feel haunted now felt alive. It was mine again, fully, unapologetically mine. One particularly reflective evening, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the golden leaves drift down. I thought about Daniel and the betrayal that initially felt like the end of my world. Now I could see it clearly. The affair had been the breaking point, yes, but it had also been the catalyst. It forced me to look inward, to reclaim myself, to rebuild a life that I could call my own. Painful, yes. Necessary, yes. Transformative? Absolutely. I realized something profound that night. Life doesn't give warnings when dreams unravel, betrayal doesn't announce itself gently, and heartbreak doesn't politely request your cooperation. But in the wreckage of these experiences, we find clarity, we find courage, we find the strength to redefine ourselves and the lives we choose to lead. I was no longer the woman who believed her life was complete only if another person stayed loyal. I had grown beyond that. That realization became my North Star. I understood that the dream I thought I was living wasn't lost. It had been a lesson in disguise, a lesson that love, even when it fails, can teach resilience, self-respect, and the courage to forge a life that honors your own worth. I felt gratitude for the pain, for the clarity, for the awakening. The woman I had been at the start of this journey was gone, but the woman I had become was unshakable. Winter arrived quietly, dusting the city with frost and softening the edges of everything I saw. I loved the season for the way it encouraged reflection, for the way the cold made warmth feel more precious. That year, winter wasn't about loneliness or sorrow. It was about clarity and grounding. I had finally reached a point where I could sit in my own company without fear, without anxiety, without longing for something lost. I had discovered that solitude wasn't a punishment, it was a sanctuary. I began volunteering at a local community center, helping families with tutoring and mentorship programs. Giving back became a balm for my spirit. I realized how much my previous life had been inward-looking, consumed by routines and expectations, and how rewarding it was to shift focus outward. Each smile I received, each conversation I had with someone younger or struggling, reminded me that life continues beyond personal pain, that our resilience can inspire others without us even trying. One afternoon, after tutoring a small group of kids in reading, I walked home and noticed how alive the city felt, even in the muted tones of winter. Snow clung to rooftops, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet leaves, and lights twinkled from windows all around. I felt a thrill of existence that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the rush of passion or the intoxication of a new relationship. It was steadiness, depth, life lived fully, awake and aware. Therapy continued to be an essential part of my life. I worked through layers I hadn't anticipated: lingering self-blame, the instinct to smooth over discomfort, the fear of being abandoned again. Each session peeled away another layer, revealing a core of self-respect I hadn't realized existed. I learned to recognize unhealthy patterns in myself and others, to assert boundaries without guilt, and to prioritize emotional truth over temporary comfort. During one session, my therapist asked me a question that hit me harder than expected. Who are you becoming because of this? I thought about it long and hard, not just the person emerging from heartbreak, but the person I had always wanted to be: calm, strong, honest, present, capable of loving fully but without losing herself. I realized that betrayal, as devastating as it was, had forced me to confront aspects of myself I had neglected. In a strange, painful way, it had catalyzed my growth. By January, I started a new project at work that had always seemed intimidating: public speaking, presentations, leading teams. I had avoided these responsibilities before, fearing failure or judgment. But now I found myself rising to the challenge with a confidence that surprised even me. I spoke clearly, decisively, and listened actively. Colleagues began seeking my input more often. I recognized that the courage I had cultivated in my personal life had spilled into my professional life. Strength begets strength. Occasionally, memories of Daniel and our life together surfaced. Sometimes I would catch myself picturing him, imagining him happy or lonely. Those thoughts no longer carried the suffocating weight of obsession or self-blame. Instead, they were neutral, like chapters in a book I had read, acknowledged, and now set down on the shelf. Acceptance doesn't erase pain, it reframes it. That was my mantra now. A small, unexpected moment of joy arrived one Sunday morning. I was preparing breakfast, the soft winter sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, when I realized I was smiling for no reason at all. Pure, unprompted joy. I had forgotten what that felt like, feeling light in a body and a mind that had carried so much heaviness for so long. I sat at the table, savoring the moment, realizing that happiness can exist even after grief, even after betrayal, even after dreams have been dismantled. Around this time, I reconnected with an old friend, someone I had lost touch with over the years. We met for coffee, and I found myself talking openly about everything: the marriage, the betrayal, the healing process. She listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and reminded me that my story, though painful, could inspire others. That encounter made me realize the value in sharing experiences, not for sympathy, but for connection. That vulnerability could be a bridge, not a weakness. Winter turned slowly into spring again, and with it came reflection. I looked back over the months, tracing the trajectory of my life from the moment I discovered the betrayal to this moment of quiet stability. I realized that the hardest moments had forced me to confront myself honestly, to question assumptions, and to rebuild a life that wasn't dependent on someone else's choices. I had learned to survive, yes, but I had also learned to thrive. I began thinking about love differently now, not as a possession or a guarantee, but as a mutual, conscious act of respect and care. I realized that I could be open to connection without surrendering my independence, without ignoring my instincts. That truth became the foundation for how I approached all my relationships, from friends to family to colleagues. Boundaries, clarity, and respect were no longer abstract concepts. They were daily practices. One quiet evening, I lit candles in the living room, sat on the couch with a blanket, and simply observed the space around me. The house no longer felt haunted by the past. Each corner, each object, each memory felt integrated into the narrative of my survival. I was not defined by betrayal, by loss, or by what I had endured. I was defined by how I had chosen to rise, to honor myself, and to reclaim my life. It was during these quiet nights that I began journaling future dreams, plans I had once abandoned, passions I had shelved, experiences I had postponed. I wrote without fear, without hesitation, and without needing approval. These entries were small seeds, and I felt their potential growing inside me. I realized that the dream I thought I was living with Daniel had never truly belonged to me. The dreams I was planting now were mine entirely, shaped by truth, resilience, and self-awareness. And in that realization, I felt an unexpected sense of freedom. Freedom from expectations, from dependency, from fear. Freedom to define happiness on my own terms. Spring had fully arrived, and with it came a feeling of momentum I hadn't experienced in years. The world seemed alive in a way that mirrored my own inner awakening. I began taking long walks in the park near my apartment, not to escape, but to observe life around me. Children played, couples strolled, and dogs tugged at leashes in exuberance. I watched all of it with a quiet appreciation, a sense of connection that didn't depend on anyone else's choices or presence. It was the first time I realized that happiness doesn't require validation from another. It exists in noticing, in being present, in embracing small moments. Work had changed dramatically. I was no longer hesitant to speak up, to take the lead on projects, to advocate for myself. Colleagues noticed, and for the first time, I felt fully competent and respected in my professional environment. The confidence I had nurtured in my personal life had spilled over into my career. It was a reminder that growth in one area inevitably strengthens others. Strength is cumulative, I realized. Each act of self-assertion, each boundary upheld, each small victory against fear built upon the last, forming an unshakable foundation. I also began exploring creative outlets I had long abandoned. Painting, photography, and writing became not just hobbies, but ways to process emotions and express myself authentically. I would sit for hours with a brush in hand or a camera slung around my neck, observing the world, capturing textures, colors, moments of fleeting beauty. It was meditative, grounding, and oddly liberating. Art became a mirror for my soul, reflecting the journey I had endured and the woman I was becoming. One day, while volunteering at the community center, I met a young woman struggling with a complicated family situation. She reminded me so much of my younger self, hopeful but cautious, loving but afraid of being hurt. We talked for hours, and I realized that by sharing pieces of my story, I could offer guidance, empathy, and support. Teaching her didn't make me a teacher in the traditional sense. It reminded me of the lessons I had learned through heartbreak, self-reflection, and resilience. Pain had given me clarity, and clarity had allowed me to help others navigate their own struggles. In the quiet of my apartment, I often found myself reflecting on the relationship that had once defined my world. Daniel and I had shared 12 years after all, and the memories were not all painful. I remembered Sunday mornings on the porch, quiet laughter in the kitchen, the way he once looked at me like I was everything. These recollections were bittersweet, but they no longer held the power to wound me. I could remember love without attachment, and that was perhaps the most profound shift of all. I had learned to carry memories without letting them dictate my present. As summer approached, I took a solo trip to a small coastal town I had always wanted to visit. Traveling alone was initially intimidating, but as I stood on the beach, wind whipping through my hair and waves crashing against the shore, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't anticipated. I had navigated the heartbreak, rebuilt my life, and reclaimed my independence. The ocean seemed to echo the truth I had discovered. Life is vast, unpredictable, and often painful, but it is also filled with opportunities for renewal, joy, and self-discovery. During that trip, I met someone new, though I wasn't seeking a relationship. We connected over shared interests, laughter, and mutual respect. It was light, honest, and refreshing. Most importantly, it was grounded in equality. I had learned that love, when approached with awareness, does not require surrendering oneself. The past had taught me that boundaries and self-respect are not obstacles to connection, they are the foundation for healthy relationships. Returning home, I felt invigorated. I had been through the depths of betrayal, the slow, painful reconstruction of self, and the discovery of joy that exists independently of others. Life felt expansive. Each day offered choices: to retreat, to dwell, to sink into what had been lost, or to move forward, embrace truth, and cultivate the life I wanted. I chose forward every single day. The final stage of healing came in a quiet, unassuming moment. I was sitting on the porch with a journal, reflecting on the journey from heartbreak to self-realization. I wrote about the pain, the betrayal, the nights of doubt and grief, but also about strength, resilience, and hope. And then, almost imperceptibly, I realized something extraordinary. I had no lingering desire for revenge, no lingering bitterness. I had made peace. Not because the betrayal was excusable, but because I had reclaimed my life, my voice, and my happiness. That night I lit candles, poured myself a cup of tea, and watched the flames dance. I realized that the dream I thought I was living was an illusion, but the life I was living now, authentic, self-directed, full of possibility, was a dream realized. Not the dream I had imagined with Daniel, but a richer, more profound one of my own creation. I finally understood that betrayal, heartbreak, and loss do not define us. How we respond, how we reclaim ourselves, how we choose to live in the aftermath, that is what shapes our lives. I had survived, yes, but more importantly, I had learned to thrive. I had rebuilt myself piece by piece, honoring every emotion, every lesson, and every choice. And in that quiet, candle-lit room, sipping my tea, I smiled. Not a forced smile, not one meant to convince the world I was okay, but a deep, rooted smile that came from the truth. I had lived through heartbreak, reclaimed my voice, and discovered the profound strength of living for myself. The months after that evening passed in a rhythm I had never known before, steady, intentional, and entirely my own. I began to understand that the life I thought I had lost was never truly mine to begin with. The marriage I had invested in so deeply, the dream I had cherished, it had been a shared illusion. And once the illusion crumbled, I realized the gift hidden in the wreckage: freedom. With that freedom came responsibility, the kind that is heavier than heartbreak but infinitely more rewarding. I was responsible for my own happiness, my own growth, and my own decisions. For so long, I had measured my worth through the prism of someone else's choices, Daniel's attention, loyalty, and affection. That perspective had left me blind to my own strength. But now I measured myself by my actions, my integrity, and my ability to show up fully for my own life. I began investing more in myself than I had in years. I joined a local book club, exploring ideas and conversations I had long deferred. I enrolled in a professional development course, challenging myself intellectually and creatively. I learned to cook meals for myself with care, to enjoy them without feeling the absence of someone beside me, to savor every sip of coffee in the morning as though it were a small celebration of independence. Each act, no matter how small, became a testament to self-respect and reclamation. The emotional landscape of my life had shifted as well. Where grief had once lingered, there was now understanding. Where anger had roared, there was clarity. Where doubt had whispered, there was confidence. I realized that the betrayal had not destroyed me. It had revealed the depth of my own resilience. I could survive pain, uncertainty, and loss, and still emerge with grace, wisdom, and self-love intact. As I continued to heal, I noticed subtle transformations in the way I interacted with others. My friendships deepened because I was no longer trying to please or overextend. I communicated honestly, acted authentically, and allowed people to see me as I truly was. It was a kind of relational freedom I hadn't known existed. Vulnerability became a strength, not a risk. And for the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not because someone loved me perfectly, but because I loved myself fully. Daniel remained a distant figure, present only in memory and occasional necessity. Our conversations were minimal and practical, and that was enough. I no longer felt compelled to reconcile or explain myself. The weight of his choices was no longer mine to carry. I had finally understood that closure doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes closure is a quiet internal acknowledgement that the chapter has ended, that the story has changed, and that the protagonist, the one whose life matters most, is you. One afternoon, I walked into the bookstore near my apartment and lingered by the self-help and memoir section. I picked up a book, leafed through it, and smiled at a passage about resilience and personal transformation. It felt oddly familiar, as though the words had been written about my own journey. I purchased it, walked out into the cool spring air, and realized that I was finally ready to write the next chapters of my life without fear or hesitation. Romance and love began to re-enter my consciousness slowly, cautiously, like a tide creeping in. But I no longer sought it as proof of worth or validation. Instead, it was a possibility, a choice made with awareness and boundaries firmly in place. I realized that the love I had been denied in my marriage had taught me how to love myself first, and that self-love was the foundation for any future connection. No longer could I allow someone else's choices to define my happiness. Over time, I also started to reflect on forgiveness in a deeper, more nuanced way. I forgave Daniel not to absolve him, but to free myself from bitterness. Forgiveness became a tool of liberation rather than an expectation of reconciliation. And I forgave myself for the mistakes I had made, for the blind trust I had given, for the moments when I had compromised my own needs. Forgiveness, I learned, was less about the other person and more about reclaiming peace. By the following winter, I was living fully in a way I had never imagined. I hosted friends, traveled alone to places I had longed to see, and explored creative projects with no agenda other than joy and personal growth. Life had become richer, deeper, and more vibrant than it had been during the years I believed I was living my dream. That dream had been a story I told myself, but this life, the life I built from the ashes, was authentic, resilient, and wholly mine. Looking back, I realized the most profound lesson of all. Betrayal does not have to define you. Heartbreak does not have to erase you. Dreams can die, but from their remains you can craft a life that surpasses even what you imagined. What I had once thought was the end of my world was in truth the beginning of everything I was meant to become. Sitting on the porch one quiet evening, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea, I thought about my journey, the love, the betrayal, the grief, the growth, the independence, the joy. I smiled softly to myself, a smile that came from deep within, unforced, authentic. I realized that I had finally learned the ultimate truth. Life does not always go according to plan, but you can choose how you walk through it, what lessons you take, and how you honor yourself along the way. The dream I thought I was living was never truly lost. It had transformed. What I now live is stronger, wiser, and freer. I am no longer defined by someone else's choices, nor by the heartbreak I endured. I am defined by my courage, my resilience, and my commitment to myself. And in that, I have found not just survival, but thriving. I thought I had lost everything when he cheated, but in reality, I had found something infinitely greater, me. And that is a dream worth living. The end.